The boy in room 7 had been unconscious for 19 days. The ward was quiet that Tuesday at 2:40 a.m. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner. Then Marcus Webb set down his mop, walked to the nursing station, and asked a question that no one in 11 months and $1.4 billion in research funding had thought to ask. Marcus Webb was 41 years old and had worked the night shift at Corrigan Children's Medical Center for 6 years, pushing a mop through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, replacing trash liners and wiping surfaces, and moving through rooms the way furniture moves, present, functional, essentially invisible to the people with credentials on their lanyards. He drove a 2007 Nissan Sentra that had a cracked dashboard he had been meaning to fix for 2 winters, and a rear seat that was permanently adjusted for a booster that no longer needed to be there. His daughter Lily was 9 and slept at his mother's apartment on Tuesdays and Thursdays when his shift ran past midnight. And she had her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's habit of going completely silent when something was worth thinking about. And she carried a small spiral notebook in her jacket pocket that she called her evidence book, because she had explained to Marcus at age 7 that the difference between knowing something and being able to prove it was whether you had written it down. He had told her that was correct. She had looked at him in the way she looked at things that confirmed her existing conclusions and written something in the notebook. He had not gone to college. He had taken a year of community college accounting before his mother got sick and the math resolved itself: tuition, her bills, his brother's school supplies, and he had left and found work and kept the accounting textbook on the shelf above the kitchen table because he had not yet stopped intending to go back to it. He read it on breaks. 2 of the night nurses had asked him what he was reading, and he had told them. And they had been surprised in the careful way of people recalibrating a category and not wanting it to show. The boy in room 7 was named Daniel Osei. He was 6 years old and had been unconscious for 19 days and admitted 11 months before that with a neurological presentation so rare that Corrigan Children's had become the center of a research effort, drawing 3 neurologists from 2 countries, 2 geneticists, and $1.4 billion in committed pharmaceutical funding. None of it had produced a diagnosis. What it had produced was a very thick file of what Daniel Osei was not, and physicians who had arrived at the same expression of professional exhaustion through different disciplines, the expression of tools running out before the problem does. His mother sat beside him every day from 7 until the nurses persuaded her to sleep at 11. She held his hand and spoke to him in a low voice, and the boy did not respond. And the team had held a meeting 4 days ago in which the word palliative had appeared in 2 separate sentences, and no one had challenged it. Marcus cleaned room 7 on Tuesdays and Fridays. He had been cleaning it for 11 months. He did not speak to the boy's mother during the cleaning except to say "excuse me" when he needed to move something near her chair, because she was exhausted and he was a janitor, and the interaction that was useful to her was not conversation. He moved around the room with the specific economy of someone who has cleaned the same space so many times that the cleaning is now a form of attention. He knew where the dust collected. He knew which surface the nurses touched most often. He knew the exact sound the ventilation unit made when it was cycling normally, and the slightly different sound it made when the filter needed changing, which he had reported twice, and which facilities had addressed both times. He had been in the room at 2:15 that Tuesday, mopping near the window, when he noticed the smell. Not a medical smell. Something organic, faint, specific. The way a room smells when it has been sealed for a long time, a closed air quality that had nothing to do with the ventilation. He paused with the mop in his hands and stood still and breathed the room slowly, the way his grandfather had taught him to smell timber when they were building, not through the nose but into it, letting the odor arrive at its own speed. The room smelled like Daniel Osei and like antiseptic, and like the protein drink his mother kept on the bedside table. And underneath all of that, very faint, like something left too long in a drawer, it smelled like mold. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the vent. He looked at the wall behind the headboard, which was the exterior wall, and he looked at the window frame. And then he moved to the window and ran his fingertips along the base of the frame where it met the sill, and his fingers came away with a faint gray residue that he held up in the low light and looked at for a moment. He took a photograph on his phone. He wrote the date and the room number and the words, exterior window sill base, gray residue, faint mold smell in his notebook, which was not a spiral notebook, but a small green field notebook from the hardware store, and which he had been keeping for 6 years because there were things about the building that facilities management was supposed to know and did not always know, and someone had to write them down. Then he finished mopping and pushed his cart to the nursing station. The night nurse was Diane, 16 years at Corrigan Children's, and she looked up with the attention of someone who had learned that when this specific man stopped and waited, what he was about to say was worth hearing. He said, "Has anyone tested the room for mold?" Diane said, "The room is cleaned daily." He said, "I know. I clean it." He set his phone on the counter with the photograph on the screen. "That's the windowsill. That's tonight. The smell in the room is slightly closed, like sealed air closed. I've been noticing it for about 3 weeks. He paused. "I don't know if it matters, but the filter on that room's vent was running slow in October, and it was slow again last month. And the exterior wall on room 7 faces the north side of the building, which doesn't dry out the same way the south rooms do." He picked up his phone. "I'm probably wrong." Diane looked at him for a moment. She said, "Did you say 3 weeks?" He said, "I started noticing it maybe mid-November. It could have been longer before I registered it." She said, "The team ran a full environmental panel when he was admitted." He said, "I know. I saw the results sheet in the disposal tray once." He said it without apology. That was in January, 11 months ago. Dr. Vivian Akabe was the lead neurologist on Daniel Osai's case, the head of pediatric neurology at Corrigan Children's, and the woman whose name appeared at the top of every published paper the research effort had produced in 11 months. She was also the woman who had sat in the palliative meeting 4 days ago and said nothing to challenge the word, because she had run out of challenges to offer and had been carrying that since like a stone in her coat pocket, heavy and present at every step. She arrived at the hospital at 7:15 Wednesday morning and found a note from Diane on her desk that said, "Environmental mold reassessment, room 7, please review, Diane." And beneath that, a printed photograph of a gray residue on a windowsill with a date stamp of 2:15 that morning. She read the note twice. She called the environmental health team at 7:42. At 9 o'clock, 2 technicians opened the drywall cavity behind the headboard and found a colony of Stachybotrys chartarum that had been growing undisturbed in the sealed exterior wall for an estimated 8 to 14 months, feeding on moisture where the north-facing insulation had degraded, producing mycotoxins at a rate low enough to evade the initial environmental panel, but cumulative. Enough, over 11 months, to produce exactly the presentation Daniel Osai had been showing. The case studies connecting Stachybotrys mycotoxin, exposure to this specific pediatric neurological pattern, numbered in the single digits. A researcher in the Netherlands had published on it 14 months ago. The Corrigan team had reviewed the journal. The mycotoxin subsection had not been flagged as relevant because the environmental panel had already returned clean. And a clean panel closes a question. And the question had stayed closed until a man with a mop opened it again at 2:40 on a Tuesday morning. The paper trail that connected the initial environmental panel to its early closure led, when Dr. Achebe pulled it Wednesday afternoon, to a single name on the approval form: Dr. Leonard Price. Leonard Price was the hospital's chief of research operations, a man who had been at Corrigan Children's for 22 years, and who wore his reading glasses on top of his head rather than on his face even when he was reading, so that he had to tilt his chin down at an angle to see through them, which gave every interaction with him the appearance of being observed from a slight elevation. He had approved the closure of the environmental investigation in the first week of February. He had also, Vivian now understood, been the person who had directed the research budget toward the pharmaceutical partnership that now held $1.4 billion in committed funding. A partnership whose contract included a clause granting the Pharmaceutical Foundation first rights to any treatment protocol developed from the OSI case. A mold remediation and mycotoxin treatment was not a pharmaceutical protocol. It did not require a drug. It produced no licensable intellectual property. It closed the case cleanly and expensively and left nothing the Foundation could patent. She found him in the research suite at 4 o'clock. He looked up and tilted his chin down to see through his reading glasses and said, before she could speak, I heard about the environmental finding. Remarkable oversight. He said oversight the way people say a word when they have decided its meaning will not be examined. She set a folder on his desk. She said, the panel closure was approved 7 weeks into Daniel's admission, after the case had already attracted Foundation interest. The technician who ran the original panel flagged a slightly elevated particulate reading in the Room 7 vent return and noted it for follow-up. That notation is in the original file. The follow-up was never conducted. She opened the folder. The flag was removed from the active checklist on February 11th. Your signature is on the checklist. Leonard Price set his pen parallel to the edge of the desk, precisely the way he always set things, occupying exactly the space he intended. He said, a vent return notation has nothing to do with a wall cavity. She said no, but conducting the follow-up would have led someone to the exterior wall, which is the direction a janitor looked 11 months later at 2:40 in the morning. She closed the folder. I'm presenting the full documentation to the board Friday. The Foundation contract, the checklist, the closure form, the follow-up flag. If you'd like to provide context before then, the board will accommodate it. Leonard Price looked at the pen. He reached up, the automatic gesture to adjust his reading glasses, and his hand stopped in the air and fell without completing the motion, as though he had reached for something that was no longer the shape he remembered. The air went out of the room quietly, with no drama. He did not speak. He did not compose a parting shot. He looked at the desk, and then he was simply finished. He resigned the following morning. The board received the documentation and referred the contract clause to the hospital's legal counsel. The Pharmaceutical Foundation's first rights provision was voided on grounds of research ethics misconduct within the month. Dr. Achebe found Marcus on Thursday at the end of his shift. She had looked up the schedule. He was in the corridor outside Room 7 with his cart, and the room behind him was being remediated, and Daniel Osai had been moved to a clean room 3 floors up, and his mother had been told what they had found and why. And the treatment protocol they were beginning was straightforward and well documented, and carried a recovery prognosis that no one on the team would have written 2 weeks ago. She stood in front of Marcus and said, I want to understand how you noticed. He said, I've been in that room every Tuesday and Friday for 11 months. She said, hundreds of people have been in that room. He said, they were looking at the patient. He said it without any implication in it, just the fact. I was looking at the room. She said, the smell. You were certain enough about a smell to come to the nursing station at 2:40 in the morning. He said, I wasn't certain. I said I was probably wrong. He looked at his cart. But the filter was slow twice, and the wall faces north, and the smell was there for 3 weeks. Those were 3 separate things. When 3 separate things all point the same direction, it's usually not a coincidence. He picked up the mop handle. My daughter taught me that. She's 9. She calls it the evidence book rule. Vivian Achebe looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Can I ask what you do outside of this?" He said, "This is what I do." She said, "I mean, your background, your training." He said, "I took a year of accounting. I read when I'm on break." He paused. "I pay attention to rooms." She said, "I'd like to write this up. The observation, the methodology. Would you allow your name to be included in the acknowledgments?" He said, "It's not my case." She said, "You found the case everyone else missed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How's the boy?" She said, "He opened his eyes this morning. He asked his mother for water." Marcus looked at the floor for a moment. He picked up the mop and set it in the bucket and did not say anything. Vivian Achebe stood in the corridor and watched him push the cart toward the elevator and understood, without being told, that this was not a man who required acknowledgement. This was a man who had asked how the boy was because that was the only part that mattered to him, and he had gotten his answer, and the rest of it was just paper. 6 months later, Daniel Osei walked out of Corrigan Children's Medical Center on a Tuesday afternoon in June, holding his mother's hand, carrying a stuffed lion that had waited in the chair beside his bed for the entirety of his 11 months. He was 6 years old and thin, and he looked at the parking lot and the sky above it with the expression of someone relearning the size of the world after a long time in a small room. His mother did not speak. She held his hand and walked, and the sunlight was very bright, and she let it be. Marcus was not there for the discharge. He was on the night shift, but Diane left a note on the wall of the break room that said simply, "Room 7. He went home. He picked up Lily from school, and she had new entries in the evidence book: a discarded bus transfer, a feather, a note about the way the crosswalk light at the corner of their street took 3 seconds longer to change than the one on the next block, which she had timed with her watch. He made dinner. She told him about a disagreement at school about whether something had been proved or only observed, and he said those were different things. And she said she knew, and he said good, and she wrote something in the notebook. The right question asked in the right room at the right moment can undo what $1 billion could not. It does not require a title to be asked. It requires only the habit of paying attention when everyone else has stopped. If you were the one who noticed something every expert had missed, and you knew the simplest way to say it was to just say it, would you trust your own eyes enough to walk up to the nursing station at 2:40 in the morning? Tell us in the comments, because that question is harder than it sounds, and we think your answer would surprise you. Share this with someone who underestimates what quiet attention is worth. Subscribe. We are here every week. We read every one.